Welcome to today's Australian Water School webinar covering tips and tricks for model reviews. I'm your host, Craig Price, and I'm excited to kick off our very first free webinar of our 2025 series. And we'll have lots of great content to come through the rest of the year. So even though today's webinar is gratefully sponsored by Jacobs, we'll be showing some examples from Jacobs' flood model or flood platform software. Today's topic is actually relevant to all hydraulic modeling platforms and is presented as a benefit to the industry as a whole. So looking at the spread around the world, thanks to all of the attendees for joining us today. We're looking forward to a lively interactive discussion. Let's welcome Sophia and Blake. Now, Sophia has been with us before. We'll provide some links to a previous webinar that she did for us a few months ago. Sophia, if you could just let us know where you're joining us from today, and maybe also whether you or any of your projects have been affected by some of the recent flood events that we've had here in Australia.
Hey, Kerry. Great to be here on the first free webinar of the year. Fantastic. I'm joining from Tweed Heads, which is Bundjalung country. I haven't been personally affected. This is the first year, I think, that Northern Rivers hasn't really experienced the floods of the rest of Australia, which is great for us. But I have found it really difficult to find people to talk to lately because I speak to a lot of people in the industry and everyone's scrambling around to trying to keep everyone dry. So, yeah.
Awesome. And although today is his webinar debut for us here at the Australian Water School, Blake did take the attendees of our rating curves course on some virtual site visits around Brisbane a while back. That was awesome. And he got to show off some really cool gauging equipment with telemetry. Blake, thanks for helping out with that. And maybe we'll provide a link to that course for anyone who wants to join us for that one. But same question to you. First of all, I guess, have you been affected by the floods? And then since that course material was recorded, did any of your gauges get us some good information that we can now calibrate our flood models to?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I personally haven't been affected, which is great, but I have just come back from North Queensland, township of Ingham, which has had a lot of water through it and a lot of devastated people. So that's been very hard to bear witness to, and it doesn't get any easier each time you see it, unfortunately. Gauges from the last couple of years, definitely some good data, and hopefully that's being utilised all over the place to make more informed decisions to keep people dry going forwards.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, here in WA, just over the last day or two, we had Cyclone Zelia roll through the Pilbara. Had some massive flooding. It wiped out some pretty major roadways, I guess, so from what I'm hearing over the last couple of days. And luckily, so from what I've heard, everyone stayed safe so far, but I think now we can get to work and see whether our models were actually any good at predicting the flows that we've just seen, because some of these exceeded anything on record. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you know whether your model is bunk? And I guess as the presenters get ready for their presentations, we wanted to find out kind of what level everybody's career is at. And I guess it looks like from the poll results, we've got a pretty even spread, a lot of people with a lot of experience. And so what we'll hope to get from you today is not just hear from the presenters, but make this interactive. So we've got people attending who could probably be presenting their own session on this topic. And we'd like to hear from you in the background. And let us know if you see tips and tricks that you've got in your checklists that you don't see us covering. Put those into the chat line, and we'll be sure to cover those. So, Sophia, I can see your screen just fine, so we'll drop into the background and over to you.
Thanks, Gray. Okay, so just a little bit about a little background on myself and why we decided to do this webinar topic. So I work for Flood Platform. I am part of Jacobs, but I'm part of the digital team. Although I do sit next to the water resources team in Brisbane when I go up there, so they speak my language. So that's why I sit there and I work with them, but I'm not actually part of the flood team. So a little bit of background on me is I'm kind of in my second career now. I spent my first 10 years as an engineer doing drainage design and flood studies, and a lot of urban flood models. So you'll see when we do the demo model, it's very where my comfort zone is 1D, 2D integrated models. But I was really fortunate to kind of enter my career at a time where models weren't as trusted as they are today. And I sat next to some very experienced engineers where I would start doing modeling for them and I would take results to them. And I can still hear his voice in my head. He'd shake his head and say, no, I don't think so. go back. And so I had 10 years of that, which kind of really helped me improve my modeling skills and also develop tips so that when I went to these people, it wasn't embarrassing for myself and they could see that I was learning it and taking on their advice. So that was my first 10 years. And then I moved into the software industry where I got to run training courses for products like XP Swim and InfoX ICM and XP Raft, and now Flood Platform and Flood Modeler. And when I ran those training courses, I found that people didn't join training courses to learn about the product specifically. They wanted to kind of learn how to build good models and how to kind of be an engineer. So I got a lot of juniors joining that. And that's actually how I met Blake. Is when I met Blake, I was going to a DHI course on Mike Irvin or Mike Flood. And I was really going because I had a project where I had to model a bridge and I had no idea how to model a bridge. So that's how I met Blake. And when we decided to do this topic, I thought, what better person to bring in than someone who's been in the trenches for a long time. So that's me. And I'll hand you over to Blake to kind of talk a little bit about his background.
Thank you very much, Sabir. What Sabir's politely saying is she wanted to bring in someone who's made a lot of mistakes in his career. And so initially I was very excited to be invited to present, and then it took a couple of days for the penny to drop. And then I realized, Sophia's invited me because she knows I've made a lot of mistakes. But it is a long-standing tradition for people when they have a few years of experience, and this is my 21st year of modeling this year, to start opening up and explaining some of the mistakes they've made and what's happened out of those, and peeling back the facade, if you like, that everything's perfect all at the time. So I'm a Brisbane boy, worked for DHI for 8 or 10 years, and then started WMS Engineering back in 2012. We've grown that business to 25 people all over Australia now, and there's a bit of a project map on the screen there. We're always looking to add more international experience if we can. But over that time, both at my DHI career, I was involved in a lot of mistakes and made a lot of mistakes. And in our WMS business, we've certainly made and been involved in our fair share of modelling mistakes. So we'd like to join the tradition of, say, the Australian Rainfall and Runoff, Project 15, the authors of the Australian Rainfall and Runoff. All of the chapters done a fantastic job in that Project 15. They share some of the mistakes and errors that have been made in the past. It's a great reference. But if you go back to the 80s, there's some excellent textbooks written where some really interesting mistakes have been shared and the impacts of those. So we've got a bit of an agenda for you today. What happens when we get it wrong? Some of the modeling mistakes that we've seen or made, and we'll let you maybe guess how many of those we actually made or how many we saw. Some tips on spotting and avoiding these errors. So what we can do at all levels of modeling career, so young modelers, people with lots of experience, and managers. I spend a lot of my time with managers. They might be in the public service or they might be in a large engineering consultancy, and they come to me and don't have a modeling background, but they're now being expected to be ultimately responsible for modeling work on design projects mainly. And they're like, what can I do to spot these errors before they get too far down the line? And then we got some time for a Q&A session at the end. And we've got a webinar chat that you can make comments in and ask questions to. So what happens when we get our modeling wrong? Well, I guess the biggest thing is flooding happens when we get it wrong. So what do we mean by that? It doesn't rain more because we've got our modeling wrong, of course. But we can end up getting inundation in places that we didn't expect it, or we get it in places, where we told people that it wouldn't be, or we put something in the floodplain that makes the situation worse, like the existing situation worse. That's very obvious. That impacts on people's flood insurance. And it can also make construction very expensive in the future around those areas that become problem areas. something that I see increasingly, especially in Australia, is modeling that's overly conservative, which makes the construction cost more expensive. So there's not as much optimization of proposed bridges and culverts and other alignment features as what there was 10 or 15 years ago, despite all the advantages and all the faster tools that they have. So if we get things wrong, we can be too conservative and make things more expensive to construct. Or we can have things that are too small and the infrastructure gets washed out. If our mistakes are discovered partway through a project, obviously it can result in project delays or costly redesign. And ultimately, these things can damage our reputation as modelers. They can damage the reputation of the business or the government entity that you work for. And ultimately, it damages the opinion of us as an industry. So, yeah, quite rightly, when there's a lot of flooding and the questions are asked of industry, and if mistakes come out, then people lose confidence in the modeling tools that we use. I often hear people talking about, oh, you just break the watercolors out and paint all these nice maps. The reality is, as you all know, there's a lot of work that goes on in the background to that. With the reputational damage, I will just mention that you can ultimately improve your reputation if by the way you handle mistakes when they're found, and we can talk about this in these next examples that we've got coming up. So the first one that I'd like to share with you, I think I've got 5 in total. The first one actually happened quite recently. It was a subdivision, so a residential subdivision in a floodplain area, and the model missed the peak flow. So fantastic hydrological model, fantastic 2-dimensional model, no problems in either of those. Just the model wasn't run long enough in both the existing and the design case, and therefore it missed the peak, and which is when all the impact happened, essentially. So the report has been done. It's been submitted to council for approval. It's been approved, and luckily in this example, the finance for the development didn't get up, and ultimately the development didn't go ahead. Now, fast forward a couple of years later, and it was about 2 years later, the same developer came back to us and said, we've got a new financer on board. We want to make a few changes to the fill pad design, or we have made a few changes to the design, because us flood modelers are often the very last people to get involved in the whole process, which can cause other dramas. Can you rerun the model and check that, update the report, send it off to council for approval again? And then it was like, oh no, well, look at this. We've totally stuffed up. This model was never run to the egg. Okay, let's run it through and let's see what happens with the new design. And of course, there's an impact. And then we run it through all the way with the old design. Of course, there was an impact that we missed. And in this particular case, it was a very difficult conversation. All of these involve very difficult conversations to let people know straight away let the client know straight away where it's at. But we were saved ultimately by a very clever civil design engineer who was able to work with us to run lots of scenarios to essentially get the same yield out of the subdivision with a modified fill pad design. So we got out of that one quite nicely, but and shudder to think about big rainfall event with the original design. We had another one similar, an industrial pad, a very large industrial shed being developed in a real hurry, and basically we built a hydrological model in this case, and it should have been almost 0% pervious. Should have been close to 100% impervious, like lots of other hard stand areas around the place, plenty of very fast runoff. But in our hydrological model, we put 100% pervious, heaps of water going into the soil. And we provided the levels off to the design engineering firm. They designed the shed, they designed the slab, and right at the very end of that process, our modelling had all been approved again by the council. Right at the end of that process, that another clever engineer at that structural design firm said, "Well, hang on, this shed slab is 400 mil lower than anything else on the street. Maybe could you guys just check that you've got that right?" And lo and behold, we discovered the problem. Again, a very difficult conversation. We phoned the client, and that engineer owned up to it straight away and reran everything, worked out that adding 400 mil, lo and behold, getting to the same level as what everybody else was at, was indeed the right answer. And the client was initially very, very upset, but we were able to get onto council, explain the problem that we had, treat it as a top priority, get them to reapprove it, get it back to the client and the design engineer, and everything fell out okay. And we actually got paid for that rework, which I think is quite exceptional. We've got a really strong relationships with our clients, and what they value is the honesty and the owning the problem and wanting to solve the problem with them straight away and not try and hide from it. So it was an excellent example for anyone who's young. I mean, any modelers you talk to, if they've got a bit of age on them, they'll tell you they've made big mistakes. And if they don't tell you that, then they're a liar, right? Everyone who's in this industry makes mistakes. And so what I would like to get across to particularly young modelers or people that are new to modeling is that these mistakes aren't always the end of the world, or in fact, they'll never be the end of the world, but they often don't result in big problems. So not only did we fix the problem, the sheep got built to the heart, but as a company, we actually got paid to fix our own mistake. Example number 3 is this one is probably my favorite. It was a ring levee on a mine. So it was in the design stage. They hadn't scraped the surface yet. Very large area, nasty stuff that they were mining. So any rainfall that fell on site, any of that runoff had to be kept within the mine itself. It couldn't be allowed to run out to the environment until it'd been treated. And basically what happened was the ring levee the height of this ring levee was much higher than what anybody anticipated. Instead of being maybe half a meter high, it was several meters high. And initially that was met with some skepticism by the designers and the managers. And then eventually they got on board with it. And this ring levee was getting higher and higher. And the more models that were run, the higher this ring levee had to get. In some places, I think it got to 4 or 5 meters high. They had to hire more design engineers to work out how this thing could be designed. They had to design a haul road to work out where the fill was going to come from. There was going to be conveyor belts on site to distribute the fill to the right places. It was getting bigger than Ben-Hur. And eventually the penny dropped with the modeling team that the longer we run this model, the higher and higher this levee needs to be. And it is such a simple problem that was discovered essentially by doing a mass balance check and running a very rapid 100 cell by 100 cell model, that the model was generating its own flow. It was unstable. A lot of the time, these models, if they're unstable, they add a bit of mass because models don't like anything below zeros. They add a bit of mass to get some stability. And that was just happening all the time. So there was, 100 times more flow or water in the model than what there really should be. Now, to unwind that problem was pretty difficult. So everyone at the modeling team had convinced that this was that this ring levee needed to be much bigger than what they thought, now had to be convinced that they were wrong the first time, right the second time. So 10 people, didn't need to be involved. It went up. I remember it going up the food chain, up different management levels. And everybody was on board with this idea. So it took quite a bit of unwinding and convincing and rechecking before ultimately it could be brought back to the 0.5 meter that everybody thought it would be. um, and people were convinced that that it was going to be right to proceed with. It's a good example of how things can get under control very quickly when there's a lot of time pressure in particular. Some oversized culverts. So we see a lot of models these days. 20 years ago when I started out, it wasn't common to get LiDAR. You might get some photogrammetry, or you might get some fairly poor quality LiDAR in comparison to what we have today, and you get some ground survey. So you took all the ground survey as being super accurate, because it was, and then you were thankful to have the LiDAR if it existed, but you took it with a grain of salt. That seems to have changed a lot in recent times. I talked to a lot of young engineers or young modelers who look at this LiDAR and it's beautiful. It looks beautiful on the screen. It doesn't mean it's right. Just because it looks fantastic, it doesn't mean it's right. And say in this particular example, is a railway like that, and the modeler had taken the LiDAR as a higher point of truth than the on the ground survey. So when you go off and commission LiDAR, and modelers aren't always, we don't get invited to the table often when the LiDAR gets commissioned, unfortunately. And so that's where you end up with just the alignment 50 meters either side or something like that of a railway like this or a road. But there's all sorts of post-processing that you can opt for when you purchase LiDAR. And they run very complex algorithms over it to remove things like vegetation or buildings or whatever. And you can have different levels of that processing done. In this particular case, the modeler in the LiDAR, the shrubs and whatnot in the creek hadn't been removed. And so the modeler ended up putting the culverts up really high. And they were then running the simulation over and over saying, well, they could be smaller and smaller and smaller. In fact, I don't even think we need them. And the reality was there was never any flow going through the culverts. It was sort of going elsewhere because these culverts were up in the air as opposed to being where they should have been. And I've got another one. This is one I'm quite passionate about it because it involved a gentleman who was flooded quite badly, and he had the stress of dealing with his own flooding, but taking on the rest of the community's battle against the insurance companies and council and whoever else helped with the cleanup. He ended up having a stroke, and coming out of the stroke, his health wasn't the best, and he changed his personality where he'd yell and swear at you a lot. So it was difficult meeting with him because every time you met with him, he'd shake his fist and swear at you, and little bits of spit would go everywhere and stuff. It was very unpleasant. But so I did a flood study model, and we had 96 calibration points in a small town. We were very accurate, within 5 centimeters plus or minus of pretty much all of them. But he's adamant that we'd got things wrong. He's like, the flow did not come from that direction you're saying it did. It came from a different direction, and it wasn't the normal color. When it came through my place, it wasn't brown. It was red first, and then it was brown. And by that point, I was old enough and experienced enough to listen that when someone on the ground's telling you that you probably got something wrong, then it's a fairly likelihood you have, even if they are yelling and swearing and a bit difficult to deal with. But I couldn't, for the life of me, get the behavior he was telling me about to match. And I doubled the flows and I halved the flows and I changed the timing. I changed every parameter in the model. Nothing of what I did would match the behavior he told me about. We spoke about it. in the end, I convinced him that because the calibration was pretty good, then we should carry the modeling forward, set the design levels, because otherwise we would hold back on things and stuff could be developed and not be subject to a flood study. And then I'd look into it further in the future. And it was about 3 years later, some further LiDAR became available. I was able to extend the model further upstream and put the hydrological inflows about 2 kilometers further upstream. And bang, first simulation, there's a breakout from one side to the other. It cut through a watermelon farm, red dirt all over this watermelon farm. And the vector arrows on the animation just showed them going straight past the house. And it was just a massive aha moment. And I was able to go and see him, Bernie, and you know, he didn't stop swearing or shitting his fist. He wasn't as happy as as me. Is the fun the problem? But yeah, we were able to get past that one. Fortunately, it didn't change the flood planning levels at all. But all of a sudden, a key member of the community were able to get him on site, or 100% on site, that we got that one right, albeit a few years later. So, tips on spotting and avoiding errors. Before we get into that bit, I would like to reiterate, particularly to the young modelers, because we lose a lot of young modelers in the industry when they start realizing that they've made mistakes, or modeling's horrible because you do the job. It's all in your head. It's very challenging. And these days, you're expected to do so much work at the same time. 20 years ago, we didn't do anywhere near the volume of work that young modelers are expected to be across right now. And so your mistakes are often discovered 6 months, 12 months later, and then you realize, and then you wonder what other mistakes I've made, and then people put their resignation in and they go into some other form of engineering. Don't do that, because we all make mistakes. First thing you should ask yourself, has the damn thing been built? And if it hasn't, it can be, and has anyone been hurt, right? And if those two things haven't happened, then most of this stuff can be unwound. And the reality is the cost will only be dollars and time, which your project manager will tell you is terrible and at the end of the world. But reality, it's not. And we need modelers that have made mistakes to become more experienced and more senior, and help the whole industry make less mistakes going forward.
Thanks, Leck. I think everyone in the chat is kind of agreeing that it's really nice to have someone admit to their mistake. You said you were going to let people guess. I think people know that these are ones that you're involved in, but it's really nice to hear them firsthand. And, you know, you're still here, you're running a company, it hasn't broken you. And yeah, it's great to hear it firsthand. And that's why I picked you. Knew you'd have some good ones.
You're going to have lots of mistakes. Thanks,
but it's not unique. Everything that Blake spoke about, I've heard them 10 times over. I have been really lucky. I haven't made mistakes that have, you know, they've been caught well before something bad happened. But I remember the sinking feeling. I was working for a mining company and I was designing a huge fund diversion around a haul road. Anyone who works in mining knows that if you flood a haul road, it's expensive. So I designed this fund, finished for the day, and I don't know how I remembered, but I was just like, oh, I better check that I've connected all my inflows. So I'd done all my 1D hydrology, I connected it to the 2D floodplain, and when I went back and checked, I had missed one of the connections in the hydrograph, and my bund wall was half a meter lower than it needed to be. I think I was like 4 years into engineering, and I just remember like the panic going into the civil team the next day and being like, I'm really sorry, you're going to have to change the design. So great. They changed the design plans in a day. Nothing bad happened. So as Blake said, don't be worried if you make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Just own up to them and then we can fix them together. Right. So if it's already been built though, or if someone's been hurt, it's a little bit more tricky. But the first thing you want to do, so this webinar is not intended to kind of erase the things that you've already got. You've got your two-flow checklist, HECRAS checklist, and your corporate checklist, all of these things that you have. This is just kind of like an overarching, do these sensitivity checks, do these kind of validations that your models aren't completely wrong. So first of all, have you got the right model that matches the results? Are you reviewing the right thing? The flows go where you expect them to. So turn on an aerial, have a look at the flood, make sure that they're in the right place. I heard of a story just last week where the survey didn't match the aerials and the whole model was flowing in the wrong direction. So not going downhill. Are the flows reasonable? I know the rational method is a bit of a interesting methodology at the moment in the R&R world, but it's really useful to just make sure that you're in the right ballpark with flows. Are the volumes sensible? So I'll show you how to do some quick checks to make sure that you've got the right volume in the model, make sure that you haven't missed anything. And does the model represent the ground conditions? So as Blake was saying, having a culvert that's sitting up in the sky is not going to do much for you. So make sure that you've got a good representation of what's going on. And the last thing, I see a lot of kind of young modelers, they go straight to the simulation health checks, making sure that the model's running well. The model could run well, but not have the right volume or the right flows in it. So that's kind of for me, that's kind of the last check you do. You make sure that the model's sensible, and then you make sure that it's healthy as well. Craig, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate again, these checklists that everybody has. Everybody's got their own, and we want to kind of compile from the audience any additional items. So I've got these ones from Blake. I'm just keeping a running tally here of everything that we're doing. So keep the comments coming in the background. I know there's a question for Blake there in the Q&A line. We'll go ahead and hit those. But yeah, let's crack on with the presentation. Just remind you all that this is interactive, and we will hit your comments toward the end as part of a panel discussion, and would love to incorporate your input and your feedback into something that does benefit the industry as a whole. So keep those coming. Back over to you.
Thank you. And the more tips we've got, the busier I'll be next week, because I'll be the one compiling them all into a nice little PDF or Excel spreadsheet for everyone. All right, before we get started, a bit of a warning. Some viewers may find the following modeling errors disturbing, particularly if you're someone who's done it before. Perhaps you didn't realize it was an error, and now you'll see why it's an error. Viewer discretion advised. Okay, so the first part is just make sure that you are looking at the right results to match the model. This is, we're a flood platform. We are quite model agnostic, but this is all kind of based on a two-flow model. But the things that we are checking kind of relate to whatever you're using. So I've been caught out on this. I have been looking at a two-flow model results, seen that I've made some mistakes, gone back in, started updating the control files, and then someone's asked me to go to lunch or something more exciting. I go do that. I come back. I start looking at the results, forgetting that I haven't rerun them all. So make sure you're looking at the right thing. Make sure you do a model log. Lots of people don't do model logs, even though we all know that they're important. So in Flood Platform, and you can do these checks, by the way, in lots of other products. I am working for Flood Platform, so I'm going to show you in Flood Platform. But it's been built to kind of manage your models. Make sure that you don't do things like look at results that don't match the model. Make sure that you are handing models over complete when people are going to review them or, take over those models. I'll show you that in a second. But I think the biggest tip, the biggest trick or tip is just to have a look at the simulation. And it's really important. I think it's pretty recent that there's lots of different tools to visualize time varying data, but it's so important to do that. And especially with something in the background, some survey or aerial imagery, to make sure that you've got the right flows in the right places. And then you can really quickly see, have you got the right inflows connected? So like me, you can see if you've missed an inflow connection. Do you have the right catchment extents? You would think that in today's age, with all the tools that we have, that people wouldn't get the catchments wrong, but they do. Do you have initial water levels so you can see at the start of the simulation whether you do? Are there other outflows in the right places? So do you have glass walling happening? And then also oscillations. So they're a key sign that something might be wrong in the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump over to Flood Platform. So Flood Platform, if you haven't heard of it, it's not out yet. It's a brand new tool from Jacobs for modeling, for managing your models. and it is a SaaS-based solution. So literally you just log in and upload your models. So this is it. I've got lots of different workspaces with models in it, but I've created a demo model with lots of different problems called Oops. And first of all, I can make sure that all my model files are there, right? So I can go and have a look at all my model files. But the simulations are created from the model files, and the results are uploaded and make sure that they are matching the files that are with that model, so you know that you're reviewing the right model. So just having a look at the results. Right, so I'll talk about simulation health last, because as I mentioned, it can be healthy, but a bad model. Right. So the first thing we want to do is actually have a look at the time-varying results. So I'll mention my background in 1D, 2D urban models. This is why I feel right at home with this kind of demo model. Right. So I've got quite a good, I think I've got 1 minute result time step. So if I play my simulation, you can see the flow starting to build up in the model. And on first look, everything's looking actually quite good, right? This is a 1% AEP event. So you expect a bit of flooding in the streets, pretty expected. If I go back to the start of the simulation though, right? So this is kind of at the very start of the simulation, you can see first mistake. In the aerial, there's definitely water in my pond here, and I've got no initial water levels. So there's a first problem. So that's going to impact the flows going through these culverts through here, the flooding, and then the discharge potentially of this pipe network. So I'm just going to track them as I go in Flood Platform. So the other thing I can see is there's flows coming in from the model. So this is actually the model extends through here. And I've missed a whole catchment, which is part of the airport at the Gold Coast. And so there's flows that come in here. I've got one external flow, great. But I've missed this one. So there's no inflow coming in here. Perhaps I've named it wrong. Perhaps I've forgotten to put it in my control files. Something's happened here. So I can see that no flow. And if I move into simulation, nothing's happening. Okay, so from looking at the visualization of the results, I found two problems. So if we track through again, and love to know after I finish this if Blake does similar things. But what I go and do is I have a look at where the flooding is happening. And so straight away in the west part of the model, you can see that there's flooding happening in this industrial estate. And if I zoom in here and I go and turn on my arrows, right. So you can see from a static map, you can kind of see that what's going on here. There's some circulating flows. And if you simulate that, you'll see arrows bouncing around in angles. That is a clear sign that something's going a bit weird. So what's happening here is there's no downstream boundary on the model. And so the flood is just not escaping. So I've actually seen detailed modeling projects go out the door, ready for someone to go and investigate when it's just been a boundary problem. So last walling. All right. Back into visualizing the model. Okay, step through where it gets a little bit deeper. So you can turn on the maximum results, but I like to play around. So the other thing you can see is the overland flow paths. So there's one through the center here. So you can see there's some pipes actually collecting that flow, taking it out to this main channel. And then there's also an overland flow path going through this park. What is strange is, so in this particular visualization, the orange is kind of the deeper water, the purple is the shallower water. You can see that there's deep water and then there's no pipe. There's nowhere for it to go. So what's actually happened here is, if it was me, I saw this, I would go out to site or send someone out to site and say, what's going on here? Something's potentially being missed. So there's actually a missing culvert. So again, you'd see that kind of circulating flow through there. And what that means is all the flood levels up through here are wrong because there's nowhere for the flow to go. Right. Got lots of problems in this model. Hopefully no one's too concerned yet, too disturbed. So going through this main channel, we've got the exact problem that Blake spoke about, is we've got this perched culvert, but I'll talk a little bit more about that you can see it from the visualization, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the 1D results. The alternative that we have, and I hear about this happening a little bit, is because there's modifications being made to the LiDAR, the road embankments are being stripped out in some circumstances. What's happened here is, at the demo model, there's no road embankment, but the culvert's still there. So what's happening is there's kind of no obstruction, flows going through the culvert, flows going through the creek. Definitely wrong levels and definitely wrong flows going through the culvert because it's not forced to go through there. So again, what could happen is in a 2-flow model, you can just forget to add the shape files when you're making modifications. All right. So follow along the creek. Oh, hang on, what's going on here? Right, so there's lots of different ways to modeling buildings. There's lots of different papers, and there's probably a webinar on it. I personally like to include them in the kind of ground model so that you don't get things like this happening. So these poor people in the penthouse on the 20th floor of this hotel would be a little bit concerned if they saw floodwaters hitting their penthouse. So that flow path is completely wrong just because the buildings haven't been included in the model. And that, of course, affects the water depths in the roads because water can escape when it really shouldn't in reality. But one thing that is good about this model is we can see flows coming out of the outlet. So that's what we would expect. We want flows coming out. If we move down to the kind of the southern area, you can see there's a culvert here, no flow coming out of there. So potentially no flows getting in. Maybe it's a perched culvert, or perhaps we haven't got enough catchment covered in the model. So what have I got? Six problems in the model identified just from having a look at the time series results against the aerial. A really good way to just find those kind of big problems. Right. Back to the slides. Oh yes, I said, Blake, have you got anything else to add there of how you start with the model?
Yes, I think excellent demonstration there, and particularly if you're a manager listening in today, think about how much money you could save, or time. Time is money in the consulting business, but just by identifying all those problems and being able to communicate those with your modeler. The place I often encourage new managers to start is to get your modeler to show you the 2D representation, particularly play an animation of the flood level, rising and then falling, and get them to pause it regularly and explain to you what's going on. And usually, if there is something that's a bit amiss, people, the young modeler or modeler will identify themselves before you even have to say anything, or before you identify it. They're like, "Oh, that doesn't look right. I'm going to go back and fix that, and then I'll come back and see you a bit later, and you can get them to talk you through it again." But it's so powerful having these 2D representation with the vector arrows playing through the simulation. And in this case, because we're not always with each other all the time anymore, being able to leave comments or to be checked into is just amazing.
Didn't even have to pay you to say that, Blake. But yeah, I think what you're doing with your juniors is making them step through that simulation is exactly the benefit that kind of I had as a junior, which is why I got to model and learn all these things without making as many mistakes as others, or perhaps I just don't know about them. Okay, so after you've done the visualization simulation, good idea. We've already picked up a few problems in the DTM, but you also want to go and make sure that you are representing your ground correctly. So you want to make sure that you don't have 10-meter grid cells to represent a 1 meter wide channel. You want to make sure that you've got roughnesses and losses included in the model and they're reasonable. I did hear another story of people making a typo on the roughness, which slowed all the flow down, which made the infrastructure they were designing much smaller than it needed to be. So good thing to check those, and you can check the check files in Flood Platform as well. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try to get through this as quick as possible. But the next one is just reviewing the 1D representation. So I do see a lot of people just kind of turning on the values, kind of the maximum values in a 1D model and making sure everything looks okay. I think it's really important to go and have a look at and graph some of the flows and the velocities going through your structures, because if you've been modeling around for a while, you've probably seen a graph like this, and it's a key sign that something's wrong. Hydrographs should be nice and smooth. They shouldn't be jaggedy like this, and I'll show you what's causing this in a second. The other thing you can do is you can do a pipe capacity check. So TwoFlow's got one built in, so there's ICM, lots of other products probably do. But what you can also do is I had a chart like this that sat on my desk when I first started to kind of get a good feel for what size pipes can carry what size flows. So I'll put a link in the chat to this in a moment, but the product that culvert manufacturers have this in the handbook so that you can actually pull this up. So it's just like an order of magnitude check. So if you've got a 600 diameter culvert and it's taking 20 cumex, something might be wrong, right? So always good to just have a good feel of what flows go through culverts, and if you don't, grab one of these charts, or pull out your calculator and start doing some manual Manning's calcs. The other thing is, if you are doing major structures, and I've done this and I've seen other people do this, major bridges, major culverts, it's a good idea to either do hand calcs to check that it's okay, or if you don't know how to do that, grab a chart from a manual, or go and grab, if you're doing a TwoFlow, go grab HEC-RAS and model it in both. Make sure that they kind of align, or do one in 1D and one in 2D. Make sure that you're not completely out orders of magnitude wrong. Okay, so I'll just jump back to Flood Platform and show you how you can, hopefully I will. There we go. Right. So we've got all the results in Flood Platform. Just turn this one on here. Right, so this is the perched culvert. And I can just go and plot. So that's definitely unstable. Something's going on. Flows are bouncing upstream to downstream. Well, actually, nothing's really getting in there at all. But if you actually minimize that for a second, if I just plot TwoFlow's kind of results that I see people just do static maps of, which is the pipe flowing full? Okay, well, if you grab that, actually, yes, the pipe is flowing full at some point. And actually, it looks like it's flowing quite full for quite a long time. So what's happening is flows are just being perched up at the top and the bottom, but they're not actually flowing through correctly. So good to always do more than one check on what's going on there. The other thing you can do, which I think is useful, if you've got inflows or you're going to have boundary conditions that you're looking at, PO lines, everyone in the TwoFlow modeler knows a PO line, right? So have a look at your outflows or your inflows, make sure that they look right. This looks a little bit odd. But the other thing I noticed with this graph is the simulation hasn't potentially hit the peak yet. So exactly like Blake's problem is he designed a whole urban development that was the wrong floor levels, right? Just because you didn't run the simulation long enough. So don't make that mistake. Okay, very simple. That was it. Back to the slides. Okay, so I did say the last thing to do is to do the simulation health, because this model looks stable. It looks lovely when you do the simulation health checks, but we already know there's a whole lot of problems. The other thing you want to do is have a look at the total volumes, particularly if you're using direct rainfall rain on mesh. What you can do is have a look at the volume, the total volume that's coming into your model, minus any kind of initial values or boundary conditions that you've got. Have a look at that total volume divided by the area that you're modeling, and that should give you your rainfall depth, right? So if you're in Southeast Queensland doing a 1% AP, 120 mils, something like that, is reasonable. If you get 2 meters, something's wrong. And that sounds crazy, and again, I hear a lot of stories. But someone that I work with was telling me that they had a model where someone had put a typo in the two-flow files with the rainfall, and the rainfall was 9 times more than it should be, right? So a simple check, like checking the volume across the area, can prevent those kind of things happening. So just jumping back into Flood Platform, right? One thing that is quite nice about this is it gives the information to you in kind of the dashboard, right? So wet cells, you want to see those decreasing. If you don't see those decreasing, you've probably missed the peak, or the flows can't get out of your model. This is a HPC run, so what it's doing is it's reducing the time steps to make sure that it's stable. So you don't get those kind of mass volume errors that Blake was talking about. But you can see there, if I saw really low time steps in there, then I'd be worried that there was an instability in the model. We don't want instability if they can produce more flow. And then if there is instabilities in the time steps reducing, you can actually have a look at what's causing that. So is it deep water? Is it high velocities? What's going on? If you're someone that likes to dig into the details, which I certainly am, I bet Blake is too, you can actually go and have a look at the log file as well, right? So you can go and have a look here. So there was no repeating time steps, which is the good thing. And then you can go and grab those volumes and do that volume check. All right, I think luckily, we're out of time and out of slides. So key takeaways, I think Blake's covered them pretty well, but just to summarize, do your site visits, listen to the locals. When I worked at council, we actually used to go to the operations team, show them the flood maps, which now we can show a dynamic flood map. And they would tell us where we got the flooding over the roads wrong. Visualize the simulation. Don't just print out a flood map. Don't just print out the maximum results. Do your sanity checks. So rational calc, Manning's calc, volume checks. Ask a friend or a colleague before it gets built, before anyone gets hurt. So a lot of people are probably nervous to go and get their models checked or to ask someone how to do something. Just do it and you'll learn from it. Or maybe there's nothing wrong with it in the first place. And then you'll be proud of yourself. If you're a viewer, as Blake said, get asked to walk through the simulation so you understand what the model is, and potentially the model will find their own mistakes before you do. And the last one is, I was talking to Craig and Blake earlier this week, use the resources that you have. So this webinar was not intended to kind of be the end all. There's heaps of resources out there. There's HECRAS training, there's two-flow training, there's ICM training. They're the experts in those models. They will tell you which parameters to use, what checks to do, what to look out for. And there's also heaps of resources, which I think has just been put in the chat now. And hopefully lots of people have put their tips in with lots of different resources as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Sophia, for that. Yes, as you mentioned, a lot of people have been putting some great tips in. We're going to collate those and compile them. People asking about break lines or appropriate cell sizes and whether, what kind of a difference that can make in your model. We will provide a whole bunch of resources to you if for anybody who's interested in HEC-RAS. I've just got a video of them recording now, which should be available in the next day or two on the RAS solution page, where we walk through exactly this with HEC-RAS examples, showing some of the things to check for that are really common to any models. So that includes, watching for oscillations in the plan view, things bouncing back and forth, watching for oscillations in the profile view, looking and just checking the basics, like Sophia was mentioning. The just going back to first principles. We've got I've got one video that we'll post too that just one simple equation: v squared over 2g. Are you adding energy to your system, artificially? Are these spikes, could they be real? Q equals VA. That's another basic equation. If you did look at your cross-sectional area and multiply it by the velocity, are you getting the discharge, the Q, that your model is saying you should be getting? So these, going back to some of the first principles is absolutely critical. And we'll compile again some of these same things that Blake mentioned about checking that your flow is receding everywhere. A lot of people just look in the main channel and they're like, okay, well, the main channel stopped receding, or is receding now, so I can stop my simulation. But meanwhile, it's still accumulating and and rising everywhere else. Steady flow versus unsteady flow, another one that people have mentioned here, and the fact that a steady flow model will fill every available storage, even if the water was never there to begin with. So we'll provide a bunch of these resources. We've got entire videos, 1-hour sessions on the Froude number. You'll want to check that. If you've got sustained supercritical flow in your natural flood model, that's not actually going to happen in reality. Your roughness is probably wrong. Check your Froude numbers. Check your Courant numbers. So we've got a whole video, a 1-hour Australian Water School webinar on the Courant number and on the Froude number. We'll link to some of those things that are good checks. And go back to some of your basic culvert calcs and the nomographs that were developed in the 1950s. Our culverts are no different than culverts were back in the 1950s. So when they drew those nomographs by hand, I had professors, that was their job for years and years, is just draw nomographs. They still work these days. So thanks for everybody in the chat who's put those in, those comments in. We are compiling them. We'll put them into a document that will be available to you when you go back to this YouTube link or go back to the Australian Water School's website. You'll have links to this over the next few days. We'll get that compiled and posted for you. That's a great resource. And Blake, I can't tell you how many people were appreciative of the willingness to admit mistakes. Everybody finds from consultants these brochures that say, we do everything perfectly. We can do everything and we don't make mistakes. You're not going to put that in your brochures, but having it in a training session like this, I think gives some people a little more confidence. And we had a lot of applauses and little emojis coming back while you were, fessing up to some of those things that some of us don't want to admit. But when we do admit them, we all make these mistakes. It does make the industry and the practice better as a whole. So we're nearly out of time, but let's go back and just have closing remarks from both of y'all, and then we'll put some additional resources up on the screen. And we will be hearing from Sophia again in a few months' time. So tune in and subscribe to the Australian Water School's webinar so that you'll be notified when great content like this comes back again to us. So Blake, any closing remarks from you, and then we'll let Sophia wrap it up.
Look, thank you very much for having me. Please, if you're a young modeler, understand that everybody makes mistakes. Often the consequences aren't nearly as big as what you think they're going to be. These things could be solved, even if they be constructed. Often they can be solved through other means. Please don't run away from the industry over a few mistakes. But thank you again for having me on board today.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. And even for the most experienced modeler, 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience out there, having a standard checklist will remind you, oh, wait a second. I remember when Blake told me about that thing that got messed up. I better check this or that. Having a standard checklist out there can keep us all on our toes. Think about the pilots out there who have done this for years and years and years. They still every time have to go through every step of it and say, wait, did I check this, and this? It might just be a box ticking exercise, but hold yourself to it, because some of these things that people have mentioned in the background, I'm like, hey, I haven't checked that in a while. And I love hearing all your insights. It's great to hear from the whole industry. We got I think we had 500 people or more register for this webinar. Many more will watch this online. So we want to gain and improve our modeling experience and our modeling capabilities based on your feedback. Sophia, bring it home for us. Thanks so much for this content.
It's great. I think that's a really good point. It doesn't matter how senior you are and how long you've been doing it for. You can make silly mistakes. I know when I'm drawing catchment boundaries, which I've been doing for 20 years, I still sometimes run a direct rainfall model over it, make sure that I've got the right boundaries. but yeah, I'm glad that we got to share a topic, and I'm glad that Blake was so open and honest, and everyone can learn from his mistakes or his team's mistakes. But we are trying to make Blood Platform a product that's really easy to use and kind of do these checks. So for things that you find difficult, that you wish was a 2-second job, please contact me, get in touch, or put them in the chat, and we'll add them to the list of things that we want to do. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, you'll see a few slides here on the way out, or a few links here that you can scan this link for additional information. Do not leave us without giving us your feedback on what you want to see more of. It'll only take a second. If you, when you exit this webinar, it'll ask you, what kind of content do you want us to focus on? We've got the rest of 2025 here. A lot of it's starting to fill up, but we do have some open slots for some cool topics and additional content, and we value your feedback and want to make sure that we consider that as we develop the rest of our webinar and training series. You do get professional development certification for attending these things, and so do maybe talk to your office. You could do a lunch and learn for these webinars as they come up. Get everybody together, facilitate the discussion. It can only improve things for the industry as a whole going forward. So thanks so much for being with us today. We appreciate your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you again on future content through the Australian Water School. Bye-bye.